us have lost people we care about now, I think, most of us anyway, to this virus. And so I know that to talk about it is sensitive, and it could bring up emotions in us. So please know that I'm aware of that. And if I don't show the appropriate reverence for that, I apologize. It's difficult sometimes to balance the emotional feelings about these cases as well as I'm trying to get to the content. So I'm doing my best. So caring for our vulnerable children during child welfare. So I just want to start with the idea that most of us who work in the child welfare world, we're dealing with how do we keep our little ones safe? How do we take care of them? Who are we? Earlier this morning, when I left, I said, I think all of us agree that we all like to take care of little ones. But sometimes it's harder when taking care of a young one requires, or keeping a young one safe requires engagement with their parents who we might not feel comfortable with, we might be unhappy with, discouraged, frustrated. I've had that experience several times in my own family, and it's difficult. And we want answers. We want our people to be healthy and to thrive. And so we want things that we can't necessarily make happen. We want it to happen quickly. And so out of that frustration comes the natural human emotions, right? So human emotions come in where our hearts hurt. We want it to hurry up. Many of us have, maybe not us specifically, but in our inner circles, I'm sure you all have people that struggle with emotions. And so sometimes the only anger is the only one that comes out ever so clearly, right? So we have to keep all those things in the backdrop as we talk about evaluating safety. Next slide. So I want to start with who, I started this talk earlier as to what our traditional approaches are to child welfare. In this world now, for any of you who are following all these crazy dynamics of what's going to happen, we're seeing how people take a different approach across the world, but particularly in the United States, as to parenting, right? So kids are home, we're trying to protect them from COVID. We're trying to keep them emotionally well. We're trying to keep them stimulated while many of us are working, et cetera. And we're finding that obviously, one, we don't have a universal approach. There's no universal right way of doing things. And second, that we put a lot of judgment on the way people do that. And so, we have to keep in mind that we have to maybe withhold judgment on the things that aren't really our business. And we can have an opinion about it, I suppose, but when it comes to bringing them into our world, maybe that's not appropriate. So traditionally, if you all think back or reflect back on the way we were all raised maybe 100 years ago or 200 years ago, or for all of time, we were raised in clans and community with shared responsibilities and shared parenting, right? So the nuclear family is a relatively new concept to many of us. I've had one of my tribal leaders that I listened to talk about how he felt that the introduction of the nuclear home into his community really put up a lot of barriers as to how they started to care for one another. So of course we didn't have CPS, right? So when children were unsafe, we just all shared the duty to keep them safe, however that may have been. It's a natural instinct to protect our young, and our young are not only our own biological children. Next slide. So I answered this morning, and we had some good answers, so I want to just kind of reflect on it a little bit. But let's think about now the kids that we take care of, the children in our lives, the children in our personal circles. I myself have 2 children. I have a lot of nieces and nephews. I have an adult person who I treat as my daughter and her children. And we have people. Who did you rely on to help with those children? Or who do we rely on to keep those children fed, sheltered, safe, and raised into an adult? So we talked earlier this morning about who did that for us, but who are we leaning on to help guide us, who are helping us guide children today? And I hope we're still, you can put this in the chat, I hope we're still leaning on our extended family to lean on these for these kids. we're conditioned kind of not to in the mainstream world in a lot of ways. And I mean, how many times have you shared parenting advice or heard parenting advice and it's been dismissed and said, you know, oh, these are my kids, I'm going to do it my way. That's fine, right? But how do we navigate those discussions and share out of love and compassion and shared ownership of these children? Most importantly, who belongs to the child? So I want my children to know that their people are not just myself and, you know, their parents, but their grandparents, their cousins, their community, um, their ancestors, their everything, all those stories that came before them are a part of them. My children live here in Denver, Colorado today because of choices that I made. And those choices were influenced by choices of my parents and my grandparents and all the outside influences that led to this story. So I want my children to know that and feel connected to that. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so go ahead. If you have any reflections at any time, please chat so that I can respond to it. I really prefer in person or being able to see you on the screen. So it's hard for me to just talk in to thin air. So whose business is it, right? When something isn't going right for a child, say, what if we couldn't call CPS? Okay, so wherever you live tomorrow, CPS is out of business. They're not answering the phone. There's nobody coming. What would we do, right? What would we do if we saw a little one, an unsafe one, left alone all the time? Like, what would we do? What if we saw a child being physically injured by physical beatings? What would we do? What would we do if we knew of a child being sexually molested? Would we intervene? I mean, there's different levels here as human beings. I'm asking us from a human context, not with our professional hats on, but from a human context, just as one human being in community to another, what are the different ways in which we could respond, right? Would we try to talk to the parent? We would say, you know, it looks like you aren't able to take care of this child when you must go. It seems like you must be going to work. You know, can I help you? Can I make sure he knows where I am, that we're here during this time, etc. What about, you know, can we intervene on the physical stuff? Does it matter? Would it be way different if it was our relative versus a stranger? Can we offer help? Would we, I'll tell you that in some of these situations, it would be met with very serious confrontation and intervention. But if it was not just a relative, but also a neighbor, there's different ways. Could we approach it with love for all or just love for the child? And then, of course, in today's world, I think we need to be honest that in some of these cases, it might not be safe to intervene, particularly if it's not our own relative, right? So if our neighbors, right, it might not be safe if we don't know who they are. So there's all these different dynamics. But I do think that we need to remember that the human impulse is always within us. And no matter how we approach this, we come from it from our own human experiences and point of view. So we say, I would never do that. Maybe not all of us, because some of us are, you know, been trained more in depth than others on social work and other kinds of traditions. We might say, how can she do that? I would never do that. That's unacceptable. So a lot of judgment comes in, of course. That's the human side. So the next part is when we come in and we are in paid positions as either judiciary, legal teams, social workers, first responders, or service providers. Next slide. So in today's world, sometimes I know, and believe you me, I know that sometimes some of the stuff I say can seem kind of dreamy or lofty, because I'm very well aware of the dynamics that are happening in our families right now. It happens in my own, and I don't say that to shame my family, but to just know that even my own family suffers these plagues, and we don't always approach them in the way we wish we could. So why don't families intervene, right? So many of us have seen families where a child is not, particularly young children, not being appropriately cared for, and it seems like nobody does anything, right? Sometimes they feel like they don't have the legal right to intervene, right? So they say, I have to call CPS. I can't just go take my niece away, right? She could call the police on me and accuse me of kidnapping, right? True, probably true. Different ways that we could navigate those things. How do these different kinds of things resolve, right? So if you go over to your sister's house, imagine, and you say, you and your partner are having a lot of conflict. Things are not going well right now. You guys need to work on having some more peace in this house. You can't be having all this violence around these two littles. Let me keep them for a couple of days, and you guys, figure out a plan. Or I go over there, I take the kids, I accuse them of everything. Trust me, I'm more inclined to do the second by nature, but which one is more likely to get a response? Maybe neither, right? But how does it land for the child? If we focus on a child, Auntie came and took us a couple of days. She promised we'd go home. She just wanted mom and dad to work on things, or she threatened mom and dad. How do they feel? Because most of those children don't want to leave. Most of those children don't want to leave. They want the bad things to stop, but they don't want to leave mom and dad. They want the bad things to stop, but they don't want to leave mom and dad or grandma, right? Or whoever is raising them. They usually do not want a full removal that's going to be longer than a few hours or a weekend, etc. They want to stay home. They just want the bad things to stop. What do we want to happen in our personal life, not SDPS, etc., before we put them back? So I ask this because we think about when we bring them into the involuntary world of the things that we expect before we can release them. Because as a government agency, we often feel like we're worried about liability. But this is our own family, right? Our own relatives or friends. And we say, okay, I'm sure you can do it. You can call me again. I'm going to be frustrated. You can't call me every Friday night, right? But don't let's work it out. We're here. Do we want full, complete recovery? Maybe. Do we want them to make better decisions? We want them to have less violence. We want them to have support to breathe. Sometimes they're just overwhelmed and can't get things straight. And all these things, just keeping in mind that sometimes as a family member in the non-court-like world, our willingness to accept a much lower standard before we give children back to their family, especially when we have children that are older and older and older. So I want us to think very specifically about how comfortable we are based on the age and capability of the child, right? So what we expect for a teeny tiny who can't even sit up to one who can barely walk, to one who can't speak, all the way up to a teenager who needs love and support during these scary times. Next slide. So that's the voluntary process, even if it didn't feel very voluntary, right? So we call it the informal process. The next one would be when we send our paid professionals from our tribal community out to the house to intervene, but they're not going to use force. They're not going to take them to court. That's what we would call the voluntary world. So today in tribes, we have child welfare courts that allow us to have supervision over a case when a child's sometimes in the home with the parent or had been removed, but we're talking about voluntary. So sometimes the court can say, you have to do this and you have to that, or we will take the child. Or sometimes the department can say, we want to keep the child here, but we need to make sure these things are safe so that we don't have to bring any court action. So technically, we would call these the voluntary processes when they get into services or supportive programs or safety planning before we go to court. There is legal discussion from the Western perspective of due process about whether or not sometimes this is coercive. I take the position that as long as we're clear and not using false truths, as long as we're telling the truth of what we really assume is risk and how we're going to remedy that through safety, I don't think this is coercion. I think it's in the best interest of the family to give them services without having to use the court program. So what's the legal authority here? To what extent do we have them? So basically, when are we pushing ourselves in the door or when are we just leaving our card? right? So when are we saying we're here? And when are we saying, no, the child is not safe. We have to make a plan with you, or we're going to have to file in court. What's that line, right? And is it easy for all of us to see? And is it the same everywhere? Maybe I'm the only one, but I suspect not. But all of us have worked with other people who don't see it the same way we do. All of us have had people on our teams that see things very differently than you do. I see things differently today in 2020 than I did in 2004. And so, as far as when and how, right? So all of us have, so we need to have clear ideas as to what is our standard and what are we asking, what are we aiming for, and when are we going to take a child away from their parent? When are we're going to take the children's parents away from the child? Everything that child has is with that parent. When are we going to take that child, take all that away from the child? On what standards? Next slide. Are we more successful by having a paid system now? Are we getting better outcomes? Are we serving these children and families better by using a governmental forceful system? I don't know really, because we don't have a data set of untouched families. But I do know that often our system doesn't get us to where we thought. Sometimes we think the number one thing we're here to prevent is death or serious physical injury. And we don't even know that. It's very difficult to say that we've prevented deaths. I believe we probably have, but it is not an exact science. And sometimes our overcorrection and our overfear, right? So we've responded to all of these cases and done full removal. I'm sorry, has created harms that maybe didn't result in the death of a child, but the compounded harms there are not equally bad. Of course, nothing is equally bad, but devastating. So what are we doing? What are we setting out to do? And are we getting there? Are really clear questions we need to have. So when we send our state, our tribal welfare workers out, what are we asking them to behave like? Do we want them to show up with rules and checklists? Probably. Clear ideas of what the standard is for their safety checklist. But what I also want them to show up with, and I hope we all do, is compassion. I want the people who are knocking on those doors of people in crisis, of people who maybe make us all very angry. Some of us feel very emotional about some of the, I call them, some of the homes or the places where people are living, because they're not always homes, right? But it's an emotional response. And I think it's natural as human beings to not always feel pity when we see what appear to be capable functioning adults tolerating pretty unsatisfactory conditions for children and for themselves. But we need to have some ability to control those emotions so that we can get a whole scene here, because none of this happened overnight, right? So we have the right, if we can prove those things, to do things on behalf of these parents. It's called the involuntary child welfare case, as long as a court approves. And do we do better than their family and their extended family could have done? And did we use the options to engage the extended family to come in and navigate through some of those questions themselves? And that's the piece that I'm hoping we'll leave today thinking about, is what would the family have come up with on their own that we can honor, respect, and hopefully integrate into how we're operating. Next slide. So I talked about, we've always been clan and community people, right? So we come from different ways we were organized, but we were never organized in nuclear families. And so the Western perspective, which many of us, maybe if you're multicultural or if your family has throughout the history of colonization, accepted a lot of Western practices, and that fits your value set now. A lot of us have had mixed messages about what it means to be a family. And so, but one thing that I think most of us can agree with is that tribal people don't view grandparents as, you know, auxiliary or outside of the core unit. Yeah, we all know people who they might be a grandparent, but you wouldn't want them to have full time care of a child for sure. I get that, but we're still connected by and large through to our people. And so Troxel v. Granville in the United States 2000 Supreme Court case, really it's a difficult case for me to read because it really goes on and on and on and cites several times how in this nation we only really accept the rights of parents. And if you and that, you know, while many people will choose to use extended relatives, like that's not the Western way, and that we're an individualistic society. We believe in do for yourself, take care of yourself, and then when you're 18, hit the road and go make your own family. You shouldn't need any handouts. You shouldn't need any help. And I'm reminded that that's not how I was raised, and that's not the family. Even on my side of my family that's not Native isn't fully as committed to those values. And so when they say that the involuntary process of the court system will not infringe on a parent's right, nobody else has any other rights to a child, and a child has no rights to anyone under Western United States law. So tribal children for us in most of our communities are viewed as sacred, gifts from the Creator, the future of our tribes. They're part of extended family systems, not just their blood relatives. We tend to be invested in children and their whole sense of being and all their whole landscape. And we recognize that children have rights too. Many of our traditions will have multiple stories about what children have a right to do, whether it be the right to play, the right to not have discipline in their younger days, the right to choose where they spend time and who they bond with. We've empowered children, and the Western way doesn't do that. And so I think we need to keep that at the focus of things and recognize that they had a right to be safe, but they also had many more rights. And we want to make sure we still honor the rights of our children today. Next slide. So overall, humans don't like other people telling them how to parent or how to live. It's just not something the human outside of our little communities, we don't like others telling us how to be. That's true for all human beings. In many cases, only your close family could have had input when it came to family engagements, and then later some of the institutions like your church or your faith. But before nuclear family life, most communities lived communally, multi-generationally, and in shared groups and shared child rearing, not just for tribal people, but for people all around the world. And then when feminism and women went to work and technology in the Industrial Revolution happened, we hit the nuclear family. Children were given into school time, home time. We started recognizing some things like children shouldn't be working, children have a right to education, but we didn't, so it was all in the spirit of productivity versus well-being or relationships. Then child welfare in the United States started coming in to protect children from serious abuse and some of the child working labor laws. One thing that should not be surprising to Native people, if you know anything about the way tribal people have been treated by the United States, the idea that a poor child could be reassigned to a home with better opportunities was not uncommon, and it was not shocking. The idea that they will be better off, they will have a better opportunity, they will do better, right? In the spirit of, you know, unwed mothers, give their child away for somebody who can raise them better. What the underlying tension there is opportunities for growth and prosperity in an economic sense. Sometimes in the sense of how they were viewed by their community, but because there wasn't a relationship, there wasn't a value on togetherness with your natural people. It was more about productivity and the views from outsiders. This always struck difficult with tribal engagement. So when we learned from the boarding school era of what the intention was, you can see clearly when the United States imposed that on tribal people. Next slide. I'll come back to this one, but I would just say that one of my most important things, not only do we we have different views of some of those foundations, language matters, right? And so we lose things when we lose language. And when we lose language, we lose some of our fundamental values of what meant the most to us. Did we have a word for justice in most of our languages? And why is that word what we lead with so often? What is justice to a child whose parents were sick and traumatized and incapable? What is the justice for that child? If it is stranger cares taking care of them under your tribal values, that may be. But typically, I think justice doesn't land in any way when a child must be taken away from it. I don't think there's any way to make that just. I think the only way to make that is less painful than other ways. What's the least painful, least harmful way of having to intervene on a child and their family's engagement? So we need to be really careful with the words that we use and make sure that the words that we use aren't just something that we hear a lot and start to become part of our vernacular without paying attention to what they meant. Next slide. So tribes have only started being child welfare agencies with the whole CPS concept in the last 30 years. Some have come a long way with developing pretty extensive codes and programming and services, but many of us are operating in a world in which we just don't have a lot. So we're intervening because we know something doesn't look right, but we really don't have a lot of options. So in many of our communities, we know that this particular child isn't safe in the environment they have, and we don't have social workers that can spend a lot of time with that family to help them find deep behavioral change therapy, because it isn't just behaviors, it's also context around what they're capable of doing in the environment that they have. And so we put him somewhere to somebody who's doing a little bit better, that can keep the child a little bit safe. And maybe we are just delaying and adding different layers of harm. We have to do something, but I think one of the things we need to get better at is coming up with a communal solution. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of lift to do a communal solution there. So as we're in tribal governments, we're also low. We don't have a lot of funding. Some of us are using Title IV e-money. Sometimes it's really loaded with American values, and it can get captured into practice and into codes from some of the federal values, which comes from the idea that it's parent to child only. And so we have to be really intentional and careful about how we choose to navigate through those funding streams, but also sticking true to what we really want to actually be doing. What do we really want to do? Do we really want to make successful children under the families under the American perspective, or do we want to make good relatives? What are our goals here? Next. Like I said, the boarding school era really talks about what the intention of the American system was as related to childcare and what children should be. So, in the Civilization Act 1819, almost 200 years, right, to civilize and Christianize us. And they, gave schools, religious schools, opportunities to give us moral education. So taking us away from what we believe to be our morals and tradition and putting us into another fact. The fact that this has been highly successful, and I know that I come to that with mixed emotions because, of course, if you have had someone who used Christianity in your life, it can be painful to think about that have been ever forced upon you, but also when you think about if we were to start it again today, with a new religious framework being forced upon us and told that everything we're doing now is immoral, how painful that is, and how multiple generations experience that, process that, and try to do their best to raise their children with values and expectations. Next slide. Let's do the next slide again. Sorry, one more. The boarding school experience, before I come to the data point, my great-grandparents were boarding school, was to make us not speak our language and to be able to, secure land, secure a home, live a nuclear life. And it has been highly accepted and adopted, but I don't know that I would call it successful, because all of the data that we can look at for our people by and large have shown that we didn't go out and, we didn't conquer the capitalist world, and, that didn't land for us. We still live in poverty, but it's poverty that looks more like their poverty, right? And so we have to really think about, what did we want and what did our values fit? One story I have that I think fits this is the idea that these children they were from Northern Cheyenne. They were some youth team. They're self-organized, and they do a run every year to honor the Sand Creek Massacre. And they came and they talked about how they organized and how they put together this run and what it meant to them. And it was quite a powerful presentation. And immediately at the end of their presentation to my foundation, the foundation I work for, someone in the audience asked them, first question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it was just such a shocking question of values, because these children were talking about the resiliency and connection they felt to being Cheyenne and what it meant to honor this shared history. And I was very proud of the young man who spoke, because he said, I don't know what I want to do, if that's what you mean. He said, but I know I'm going to be a good relative. I'm going to stay in my community and take care of my people. That's all I really want. And to me, it was a classic example of what they wanted. They wanted us to be producers, productive, and maybe that's necessary for sure, but without the shared responsibility and some of the terrible names they would put on us in our community visions, right? They shame the way that we care about community in many, many ways. I call them microaggressions, but our value set has always been to take care of one another, and it is not an American value. The American value is you take care of this straight line, right? You, yourself, and maybe your kids until they're 18. Think about, if we give an unbiased look at the landscape of the American population right now, we have senior care that is through the roof, right? Tons of homes of senior centers where we put our seniors separate from us, and then we put our kids in separate bedrooms, and then we wait until they're 18, and then goodbye, don't want to see you anymore. Well, not really, but we believe in the concept of they should be independent. Maybe we'll give them a couple more years, but they need to make their own. But for most of us, or for a lot of us, those are terrible ideas. We should stay as community throughout our whole life journey. And the idea that we would segregate those off, even in a technological world, is different. And so if they don't understand that about us, and they're trying to navigate the sicknesses of our community, how do we know what they're really judging? So the national rate for any child in care is 4 out of 1,000 children. This data is a little bit old, but so that means for every 1,000 children in the United States, 4 of them are in foster care. And for Native kids, 8 out of 1,000 children are in foster care. And in some states, it's as high as 16, right? What's it like in our tribes? We're running right up there with the national rate for tribal children. So even when we're self-administering, we're still removing quite a few children. What happens when you come into foster care? About 50% reunification rate for many of our jurisdictions. That means 50% go to permanency other than their parents. So every time we bring a kid into foster care, there's the risk that we are severing that relationship with their family. And so we need to be very sure about what we're doing when we even start with that involuntary process. What happens to those kids who go through? What happens to those 50% or so who don't get reunified? And maybe it's not necessarily the system that did that. Maybe it was the underlying things that were there already, but it's not great news. It's not great news. We haven't done what we set out to do. None of us wanted to set out a life for a child who doesn't know how to have relationships, who doesn't know how to take care of themselves and have self-love, for a person that doesn't know how to trust themselves, to be able to hold a job, to be able to be a good relative, right? We didn't set out to do that, but that's the impact of sending children away to a place that they're not familiar with. We saw it from the boarding school returnees, right? Many of us are in recovery for the damage that was done when our ancestors, some of them came home not able to be great parents because they were confused as to what was right. They were conditioned to be taught that their ways were bad. And so this reclaiming journey that they're on is a part of all of us. So what does it mean to be a good person? Who's telling our children and our young parents that? Who's supporting them? Because the idea of bringing them into a court and giving them a list, which they don't have a framework for, isn't helping anybody. So we got to be able to find a way to make sure we know what we're measuring, be realistic about what we're setting out to do, and set out with our tribal values, which is inclusion, love, compassion, and help these families heal. Next. So I want to talk about where our lane is, safety. We are not in tribal court set out to be parenting police. We are not set out to be parenting education. We are not universal licensing of saying who can be a parent and who can't be. We should be the last resort for the cases where, but for us, this child had no other safe option. But for us, they had no other safe option. That's when those children should see a courthouse. That's when those children should say, we should tell those children, we took your family away from you until they can make you safe. I think if we think about it in the way of speaking to the child, because we owe them the truth too, we need to tell them we had to intervene and take your parents away and move you away from your parents until they could make you safe, because there was no other way to keep you safe. We took you away because there was no other way. We can't be here to say we're here because we wanted to help your parents be better, because that's not clear enough. I want to help a lot of people do a lot of things, but that's not clear enough. We need to be really clear as to our boundary is making sure we can keep them safe. If we were in the room, I would say, how many of you have siblings, friends, relatives that you wish were different kind of parents than they are, that aren't in CPS care, but you just wish they didn't parent the way they did on some issues? I think we would all know someone, right? I don't like some of the stuff my sister does, right? Or I don't like some of the stuff my brother does. But they're good parents. They should have their children, and I'll nag on them and I'll tease them and I will talk to them about what I think is different, and they do to me, right? But that's not who should be in our courts. Child, little children, we have you here because it was the only way we could keep you safe. And that's the only time we should have children. I don't believe that that's the way we've been operating. I can tell you that in my 10 years as doing dependency practice in a tribal court, that was not my framework. And it comes both from a wanting to help, so good intentions, and second, a fear that children would die, and a fear that we weren't doing as much as we could. Trusting and believing in our people is really hard. So we need to believe in them as a larger group and not as individuals. So I would ask, if we had time, I would say, look at your tribal code right now and say, what is your legal basis for taking a child away from their parents? When is our boundary? Usually says serious risk of death or serious physical harm, or abandonment. So there's no parent taking care of them at all, or meeting the basic necessities of life. So when we bring it into a space of addiction or substance abuse, it gets very blurry, right? Because maybe we're not raising them very well, but maybe they were able to keep them safe. And so is the courthouse the place to make them better? I don't know. Do we do that because it's our only option and we're so afraid? But whatever the answer to those questions are, if that child is safe, not going to end up, then I'm telling you, we can't fix it through the involuntary court process. Unless we're a family court and we're actually their actual family members, which I don't mean to make light of, because in many times we are, but stranger intervention through a forceful process is not healing families. Next. So when we have a removal, this is our process, right? So first hearing, did we have to do this? Child, we had to do this because there was no other way to keep you safe. Hopefully you can go home in a couple of days, maybe, you know. And then next, when we get to adjudication, this is when we're proving it, right? So this is the adjudication here. We're proving what happened. Usually this is 60 days, 30 days. It's usually a while. The situation is sometimes different here. And what I would hope we're doing is in the scope of not only what happened on the date of the time that the petition was filed, but also what's different now as to the decision of whether or not this child needs to go back home or go home with services or doesn't belong in the court anymore. So we think it in the context of child, your parents are still not able to keep you safe. And this is the only way that we can keep you safe even now. And then disposition, when we're going to tell them how they're going to make it safe. We need to keep in mind that we're keeping it, how are we going to make it safe? Not how are we going to make you all the way better and make your life as if we're going to start you from birth and you know, have you restart your life over. No, disposition, how can we safely reunify you? Safely reunify you. We can't think that the court process can say until you guys can, you know, have a life that I want for you. And this is the part that I got hung up on hundreds of times, because it was very difficult to say, child, this is your home. I don't like a lot of parts of it. I wish it wasn't this way, but this is your home and it's safe. And I wish it was less sad. I wish you had less trauma there. I wish that your ancestors and your grandparents and your parents hadn't been through what they have. But this is where you all are going to heal together because they can keep you safe. But you will feel the intergenerational trauma. I don't think it's right to pull you away from all of those experiences just because it's sad. This is your story. The first time somebody told me that, I almost walked out of the room because he said, this is your lot in life. I didn't like that. But what landed better for me, and I've come to understand, is I've watched my own family heal. I've watched my own family heal. I've been front row to our recovery and our slip-ups. And it is who I am, right? So it's a part of my story. We don't live in a world where we can shield off our children and reassign them and excuse them and live separately from them when we go through the pain. They need to go to any tribal council meeting or tribal meetings. We keep our children present. Children live through life with us. We just have to keep them safe. Next slide. Next, I'm sorry, we can skip this whole. Thank you. This is our question. When we took an action, if the children was safe, we terminate our action. We can still do voluntary support. So this is from the court perspective. But if the child is vulnerable, so not quite imminent injury, but vulnerable, could be hurt, could be at risk, then we go to a more of a negotiation, right? These are the supports that we agree, parent and family, that you need in order to keep your family safe. And it could be as simple as grandma's going to stay with you guys for a while, or we're going to come back every other day and make sure that, you know, that the house is still in reasonable shape and certain activities are not happening. That could be it. And then we walk away and we offer voluntary services. The only time we really move into our full speed ahead and use every hammer we have is when there's no engagement within the extended family and family to make a safe plan for children. This is a lot of work. This is a lot of work, but it's very similar to the idea of when we're going to send an ambulance or when you're going to go see the school nurse. And we really need to think of it that way. Because when we send the ambulance, that means somebody's really hurt and on the verge of injury, right? Really badly. But from that piece on, that's a full, we want to do preventative. We want to be there before those things happen. We want to talk about seatbelts. We want to talk about not choking. We want to do all those things before we get to the ambulance side. Because if we come all the way to ambulance, when we're in involuntary world, our chances of bringing that healthily back are only 50%. Right? Next slide. You're going to get this slideshow, but this is basically the idea that we need to keep in mind of the level of services that we have. We can't do removal or nothing. It can't be removal or no action, removal or no action. All of us need to hold each other accountable and support each other to find intermediate steps. What could we have done to avoid removal, and what can we do to get these children home ASAP? What can we do to safely get these kids home today? Not tomorrow, not in 3 months, not at the next review hearing in 6 months. What can we do as engaging extended family and therapeutic response to get these kids home? Next slide. The number one question I think we should all get used to answering, because if you look at your tribal codes, it'll tell you when we remove, and then it'll talk about at what point maybe you have to go to permanency on some of the more recent codes, that when you go to permanency, but none of them tell us usually exactly when that child must go back safely home. So we need to have that in our checklist. Why isn't it safe for this child to go home today? Not why don't we like the parent's house? Why don't we like the way they parent? But can they keep them safe today? Most painful and challenging and important question that I struggled with for a very long time. And I regret that my fear and emotions got in the way of being able to consent to that as prosecutor. And I had a lot of power to stop that. A lot of children can be safe. And I thought that we could make their parents be better. And then what really ended up happening is those children got reassigned to other families for generational harm. I wish I could talk about this for days, but I would advocate 2 pieces of information I hope you would use. There's something called the American Bar Association Safety Guide. And then the second piece I would like you to do is reflect deeply within yourselves and within your community and have informal discussions as frequently as you can muster. What are we doing? What is our goal? What is our shared understanding about the mission of our agency and our department? And are we here to be creating best life for everyone or just safety? Because I don't think that we could create the best life for everyone in the involuntary court process as much as I wish we could. So I don't know if there's any questions or Q&A. That was a fast hour. Usually this is a little bit longer of a session. All right. I think that's my time.
Thank you, Sherry. Participants, everyone feel free to ask any questions in the chat box or in the Q&A. I guess we could start off by asking or discussing child safety planning and evaluation and how that looks different or not during the COVID-19 pandemic.
I have some slides in there, if anybody wants to look at that, but we've had some shifting information about that, or attitudes, I would say. Some of it has been about, originally, when we thought we could get on top of COVID, we were trying to prevent spread. But now we need to also recognize, as we've known for a long time, that separation is painful. Taking children away from their families is painful. And so they cannot wait for COVID to go away. What we have to do is find every reasonable way we can to have safety provisions in there. And I would absolutely require foster parents to make space or accommodations to allow for children to see their parents. we have to do this. If we can be safe to go grocery shopping, we can be safe to visit our parents and children in care. And we've come a long way on that, but we can't wait. We could be dealing with this virus for another year, 6 months, and children just need their families. Children need their families.
Are there any resources available having to do with safety guidelines or sharing safety guidelines between courts or prosecutors?
So I would start with the ABA safety guide. Every state has a different standard. ICWA is even a different standard than state guidelines. So I would suggest with the ABA, and then if you wanted to look at other tribal codes, there's also, for anybody who doesn't use a safety tool, most of our jurisdictions do not use an actual safety tool. We use screening tools, but we don't really use deep assessment tools. And I highly recommend two: the safety decision-making model, it's called SDM, and the second one called Signs of Safety. So both of those have online webinars where we can learn a lot about safety choices. And there's some really great experts working in Indigenous communities on that. So Signs of Safety and structured decision-making models. So I recommend both of those, the ABA safety guide. And as far as other tribes, some tribes are doing really great work in being really clear, but I don't really feel comfortable telling a bunch of people to call overwork programs right now. Everybody's super extended in light of COVID restrictions. And so, do we have a question? Let's see.
We have one in the Q&A. What sources of tribal stories, children, could you recommend for those of us not growing up with those stories?
Okay, so I teach a lot of non-tribal people, and there's two things. One, I think we can always turn to art if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't have relationships with tribal people directly. I start with art and look at our stories of just how we parented, both historical and documents, as well as some of the other kinds of stories. I like Native authors. I like film, and I've not really seen film that is not, well, be careful, of course, of where we didn't live in community. And then the best place to learn culture and cultural values is from those who are experiencing it themselves. And so using humility and respect, I recommend, just when you're working with families or if you have peers in the industry, to say, tell me a little bit about, what were some of your practices around, and I would start basic. It doesn't need to be traditional ceremonies. You start basic with ideas of who taught you about girl life, who taught you how to be, and what were some of your values. There's a great values exercise by a therapist named Brene Brown, and she just talks about values, and it's a good exercise to do with your work groups. Other people might have other answers.
Okay. And participants, everyone feel free to comment in the chat box. We can provide Sherry's contact information as well if anyone has further questions. But if we don't have any other questions, we can end, and we'll take a 30-minute break. Thank you so much, Sherry, for that presentation. I always learn so much from your presentations. I'm always kind of like just in awe every time we watch you. So thank you again. So we'll take a 30-minute break and we'll start again at 3 p.m. Mountain Time. Welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, I would like to welcome everyone to utilize the chat and Q&A features throughout the presentation. We'll have time at the end of this session for questions and comments, so feel free to use whenever you see fit. Thank you so much for your participation today. We are so excited to share this training with you and to also get your feedback during the sessions. For this last session, we have Sheldon Spotted Elk, Ann Miller, and Shanley Swanson. They'll be presenting on multidisciplinary representation. Sheldon Spotted Elk is Northern Cheyenne and works as an Intergovernmental Personnel Act Director at Casey Family Programs. I was just informed that Sheldon is a recipient of this year's 40 Under 40 Award, so congratulations, Sheldon. We also have Ann Miller. She's joining us from the Tribal Defender's Office of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes in Montana, where she acts as managing attorney. Also from Montana, we have Shanley Swanson. Shanley is a licensed clinical social worker and licensed addictions counselor living and working on Bitterroot Salish land at the southern end of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our presenters.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate it, Ansley. It's always awesome to be on here. There's about 70 of us on here. So what we'll do, if you could do this for us, because we are going to be talking about multidisciplinary representation, write your name in the chat box, tell us where you're from, and then what seat you occupy. What do you do? Are you the judge? Are you the attorney? Are you the social worker? So that'd be really helpful for us. And we do want to engage you in a very direct way, as direct as we possibly can through webinar. Normally, if it was back in the day, I know we get together, and part of going to conferences is being able to network and build that network. So if it was, I don't know, in a different scenario, we could be able to see each other this way and talk to each other. But we don't have that, unfortunately, so we won't do that. But it's so excited to be on here with you guys and talk about multidisciplinary representation. I know you had some really good presentations this morning. Our presentation is actually going to hook nicely to some of those presentations. So if you attended the previous presentation about safety planning, that's definitely a part of it. Gold standard representation, that's definitely a part of it. But before I turn it over to Shanley and Ann, who are doing this directly on the ground, I want you to do something for me as well. And so it's good to see a lot of my friends that are on here. But I want you to think about something for me. What do you envision your tribal community looking like in 20 years? So think about where you're working or where you're from, and what does your tribal community look like in 20 years? So as you just think about that for a second. And so what does it look like? What does walking down the main avenue of your community look like in 20 years? What are the people like? You're filling up your gas tank on your car. What are they saying to you? What does it look like around you? When you go up in the mountains, if you live by mountains, or if you go on a hike, or you go with your family, what does that look like? So as you're thinking about that, there is a movement with child welfare, and sometimes this is often an overused metaphor, but I think it's definitely relevant here. And I'll tell you guys also are lucky the fact that we're not in person, because usually I make people, and when we're in person, I make them shout out, "I'm an agent of change." I yell it and you yell it back, because I do believe that's what's requisite for us to have impact in the systems that we're working in. Systems that, as all of us Indigenous peoples, this system was intended to take and remove children from our families, was to disrupt our culture, disrupt our families. And after 500 years of genocide, do you know what? We give back to the world. We don't give back anger. We teach the world about environmentalism. We teach the world about kinship. And so this is our area, this is our area of love. This is our area of connection, and it's our area of impact. And I think we need to be agents of change. I think judges need to be solution oriented and problem solvers. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is helping our system be oriented towards that. This isn't a program that you apply for and get a grant necessarily for. There is a cost to doing multidisciplinary representation. I'll tell you the major cost is volition, is us as a system wanting to work together and wanting to meet a family where they're at and being able to address some of the needs that the family has. And we're going to really talk about that. And for us to really have that orientation to moving upstream, as opposed to the systems that I think the state systems, of course, that sometimes our tribal systems are modeled after, we're responding to issues, we're responding to problems, we're not meeting families where they're at. And oftentimes when we do respond, it's quickly with removal of children. And then we ask questions later. So I know you learned a little bit about safety planning and how that's connected to meeting families where they're at. But definitely this is what we're here to talk about. We're here to give you a different orientation. I do want to share just a quick slide and for us to think about some things before I hand it over to Ann and Shanley. But when I think about, when we look at other indigenous peoples, we're almost the same throughout the world, actually. And so this is like a little ad from in Australia that I saw on a newspaper. But it's relevant to our system as well, you know, is that keeping a child safe is a priority, definitely what safety is about. Helping a family find a solution, that's a big part of us, is being solution oriented and change agents. But if a child gets adopted out of our community, that ends up being a life sentence. And of course, we've elevated, and you maybe have heard this, termination of parental rights, the civil death penalty. So the most brutal thing you could possibly do under civil law. And I know I don't have to lecture this group about it. We know about that as Indigenous peoples and peoples from tribal communities. Of course, when we look at downstream results, and oftentimes when you talk about child welfare systems, a lot of us, you hear this, oh, there's so much alcohol and drug abuse in our communities. Oh, there's so much of that's happening in our communities. Child abuse and neglect, family disruption, conflict, all that's happening in our community. And how do we move upstream? What's our orientation to doing that? We know meeting them downstream, meeting families downstream do not serve great results. We have some statistics that show this, and these are all national statistics, of course. 26,000 kids age out of foster care. 1 out of 5 will become homeless after 18. About half will be unemployed by 24. Less than 3% will earn a college degree. 71% of young women will become pregnant by the age of 21. So we know that the system is broken. Well, I heard a spin on this recently, that the system's not broken. It actually is doing what it was intended to do, is to cause these stats, is to disrupt families and cause these statistics that we're looking at right now. But how do we go upstream? I realize some of the roles that you guys are putting in the chat box, and it's good to see my friends on here, some of the people that I know, and some of the new friends that I'm seeing on here. I know sometimes we're limited. We don't get to make resolutions or ordinances in our tribal community sometimes because we're not sitting in those chairs. But what could we do in the chairs that we do occupy? I propose to you, or creating a system that's multidisciplinary and that represents as a holistic defense. Ann's going to talk to you all about that and what you need to do for that. But that's some things that you could do in your seat. And of course, being a good relative is also something that you could also do. Being a good auntie, being a good uncle, being a good father, being a good mother, good brother, good sister. So when I think about my tribal community and what I want it to look like in 20 years, I want to see connection. And I feel like for us, and for me to help effectuate that, to be part of that team, I have to be willing to collaborate. I have to be willing to build coalitions. And this is what we're making our call to action to you to be, is a coalition builder in your community. Somebody that creates a broad tent for children. I know my colleague Sherry, I got on enough time for her to steal my quote. Dang it, I wanted to be the one that dropped it on you. Is that I know I used to represent children and child welfare. And it's easy to tell everybody, hey, I'm here for the child. That's what I do. And it sometimes even sounds noble, right? Oh, I'm here for children. I protect children. It's a little bit more challenging when being there for the child means you're also there for the parents and you're there to help parents out. And so that's what we're talking about there, is being there for the child and making sure that they have a home and they have a community. And so that's what we're going to propose to you. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to get out of the way, actually. I'm going to turn it over to Ann and Shanley and let them rock and roll and give you something to think about. As they're presenting, I want you to be reflective of how this looks like in your community. I know sometimes that's what we have to be as tribal people. We have to be bridge builders and say, no, this is what's happening in Confederated Sayers Kootenai. We don't have the exact model that they have, but here's how I translate that to my community at Northern Cheyenne and Langmuir, Montana, so be mindful of that and be thinking of how you make those transitions. And if you have any questions, we want to make sure we're here to help you out and be a thought partner with you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann and Shanley and let them rock and roll.
Thank you, Sheldon. We can move it to the next slide, Monica. Thank you. This is just a little bit to give you a background about where we're coming from on the Flathead Reservation. And also just, I was thinking when Sheldon was speaking that I should tell you that our court system is an adversarial, really anglicized court system. And so anything that's alternative to that, that's restorative in nature, we really do have to introduce to the court system because bottom line, it's an adversarial system. We can go to the next slide. This is just the basic outline of what the 4 pillars of holistic defense are. I know that we aren't talking about criminal representation necessarily, but these concepts do apply to really any system that wants to take a holistic approach to how they address issues in families. And I should say that collaboration has really been a lesson learned for me being a criminal defense attorney. Collaboration wasn't initially the thing that was my go-to, but I can tell you that right now, as of this year, after 15 years of not having representation for parents, even though we have an adversarial system, we didn't have representation for parents in child protection cases for 15 years. And we now have a family defense attorney, an attorney representing parents in child protection cases. And that's because of collaboration. It's collaboration with social services. They were at the table with us changing the statute in front of tribal council, asking for representation for parents. They want solutions and they believe that representing parents is a way to do that. So that's my huge lesson learned for collaboration. Also, regarding some of the statistics that Sheldon gave you, my guess is that some of those statistics regarding foster care really contribute to the disproportionate representation of Natives in the federal penal system, the state penal system. We see that a lot from the Flathead Reservation because we're a Public Law 280 jurisdiction. So one of the things that started us at the Tribal Defender's Office looking at an alternative to how we provided services to our clients was seeing our clients spinning off from the tribal justice system into the state system and into prison. So when we formed, especially our reentry program in 2015, we took a look at that and we're coming up with ideas on how we could address seeing our clients going into the state system and coming back to the tribal community. But let me get to the 4 pillars. So in 2011, we, the Tribal Defender's Office for the CSKT, received technical assistance from the Bronx Defenders to implement a holistic defense practice. Holistic defense is actually a model developed by the Bronx Defenders that creates a way to provide services for public defender clients. The 4 basic pillars are really a way to guide your holistic practice and really adaptable to any population. First of all, seamless access to services is hugely important, especially for our clients that are struggling with issues of mental health and addiction. And we believe that a holistic defense practice helps us address those issues that bring people into the criminal justice system, but then also the collateral consequences to being charged with a crime or convicted of a crime. Because if we don't address both of those things, including the collateral consequences, people are going to continue to cycle through the system. And those collateral consequences I speak of are things like, you have a criminal case, you may end up in jail, you may have child protection involved in your family, either because of the child or because you went to jail and no one is taking care of your children. You may lose your housing based on a charge alone. The housing authority may evict you just because you're charged with an offense. You can lose your driver's license, you can lose your job. A criminal record can be a problem for you down the road to get schooling, to get a job, and any kind of licensing that can affect. So seamless access to services is a way to address those issues. And we started our holistic defense practice without any additional funding. So what we did, we had a small staff. It was probably about 8 to 10 staff people. We just redefined their roles to address the needs of our clients. So we didn't have additional money, additional staff. We just redefined what they were doing so that we would be client focused and client centered. Dynamic interdisciplinary communication is a huge part of holistic defense. And often there are public defender offices that say, we're doing holistic defense because we have a social worker. Well, that's not enough. There really has to be dynamic communication among your interdisciplinary team. If all you are doing, if all, say, for instance, the lawyer is doing is writing up a referral, sending it to the social worker and saying, address this person's needs, then you don't have the client at the center and you're not addressing those needs as a team. It's important for advocates to have an interdisciplinary skill set. So it's not only having people on your team that have different backgrounds and disciplines, but it's also understanding what each of those disciplines do so that you are better equipped to put the client at the center and address those issues. And Shanley can probably speak to you about how she's been key in our team to educating us on issues of addiction and the role of evaluators and treatment providers. Finally, especially in a tribal community, a robust understanding and connection to the community served is so important. And the way I like to frame it is that I'm working with my client in the context of their community. So it's important to know who the community is, who the people are who are the community for my individual client, the relations, the people out there in the community that are willing to step up and help out, and how to address safety really as a community issue. One of the things that we do is go to our culture committees on the Flathead Reservation and get input from them on how they view our work and how we can do that better. And I should tell you that the message we get from them always is, don't give up on our clients and don't give up on our people, is what they say to us. And I've always taken that to heart and remember that every time that we're having struggles. We can go to the next slide. This is just, if you can read it, it's kind of small print. This is just a overview of how how holistic defense is really such a good fit in tribal systems, using some writings from Ada Pecos Melton and Robin Steinberg, who started the holistic defense practice at Bronx Defenders. You can see the parallels between restorative justice, traditional tribal justice methods, and holistic defense, addressing those underlying issues, active communication, not just with your client, but those people in your community that are assisting your clients, and also taking people in the context of their community and taking a holistic approach. When we talk about child protection, now that we have a family defense attorney, what we're trying to do now is working with social services, with the court. We want to include juvenile probation, prosecution, and come up with a plan to intervene with families. And what we would like to do is intervene from the context of families in need of care, families in need of services, instead of that rights-based approach where it's children's rights versus parents' rights versus recommendations from social services. We would like to take the family and see, with all the agencies involved, how we might better address those issues that have brought them into the child protection system. We can move to the next slide, and I'll just give you some overview of what we're doing at the Tribal Defenders. Some of these things are modified, of course, with COVID. I think about walk-in clinic. It's kind of phone-in clinic now. But, you know, I guess we can take a negative, and by the way, COVID is hitting our community pretty hard recently. But we can take a negative and turn it into a positive. It's really been a new way to try to redefine how we're doing holistic defense and really up our game in terms of being proactive. I preach to public defenders all the time, you know, we're defense oriented. We just react, we just, you know, public defenders traditionally just resolve a case and they're just reacting to a charge. Well, what holistic defense is it's supposed to be proactive. We're supposed to be addressing those issues, reaching out to our clients. Well, with COVID, we really have to actively do that. And I am driving that home with my staff. We're not waiting for people to walk in anymore like we used to. We held ourselves out as a community clinic. People are open. People are welcome to come. The door is always open. Now we have to reach out to people and make sure we're available to them. We provide pro se assistance to people filing primarily in family law cases, but any kind of civil question that people have, we're available to assist people with that, help them draft pleadings, answer their questions, refer them to services if that's part of what they need. We're providing assistance with collateral consequences to charges and convictions. Our driver's license restoration program, which is a pretty simple program, has really been effective. I think we're up to about 360 people since 2011 that we've helped restore their driver's licenses. And probably most of you are in areas where people have to drive to get around. And in Montana, your license can be suspended for no longer for fines, thanks to the ACLU in Montana. But you can be suspended for crimes like DUIs. You can be suspended for non-payment of child support, for non-payment of civil judgments. There's many ways you can lose your driver's license. Often people, especially people that move around a lot, don't get notice of their license being suspended and what to do to get it restored. So the simple thing that one of our advocates does is find out why the license is suspended. And sometimes that takes contacting several jurisdictions in different states to find out. and then just advising the client on how to restore their license. Our cultural mentoring program is, by the way, thanks to some federal funding we got by way of collaboration with many departments with the CSKT. We're going to be able to hire a cultural coordinator who will restore our cultural mentoring program. So our cultural mentoring program are volunteers in the community that are referred to us by our 2 culture committees who volunteer to counsel our clients to reconnect to their culture. They're also doing mediations for us to provide a more restorative resolution to criminal charges. We do community outreach and education, and this picture is from 2016. We, until last spring, have been going out to Blue Bay, which is a tribal campground, and doing a cleanup every year. We do that alongside our clients. Some of those folks that you see in the picture were given a jail release to come and work with us that day. We collaborate with our transportation program on the reservation, who brings bus loads to Blue Bay to come and work. We've worked with the Salish Kootenai College staff that come and work alongside with us too. Also, the Lake County Drug Court has come to work with us, judges and prosecutors. We have a big lunch, and we get a lot of work done, but it's a really fun day. Maybe next year we'll be able to do that again. Community service is part of that community outreach. What we've been doing, and hopefully we'll be doing that again soon, we do a warrants court. So we've coordinated with our court to have kind of a warrants amnesty day where people can appear on warrants. Depending on what the prosecution and the court agrees to, it can be failure to appear warrants or warrants for fines or both. People are guaranteed they can walk out of the courtroom that day if they show up and clear their warrants. We usually do it the day before we do the community service at Blue Bay so that people can make a plan to pay off fines and do community service to do that. We provide mediation through our cultural mentors. One of our advocates is trained in mediation. And then we collaborate with the law school in Missoula. They have a mediation clinic, and students have come up to the reservation to do mediations for us. Mental Health Services Advocates is a new program. We got funding from the Montana Mental Health Trust to hire people. We're seeing such a high need, especially these days. People just struggling with mental health issues that are in our tribal jail. And they may be in and out on a weekend or sitting in jail, waiting because of the system wants them fixed before we can let them out of jail. And so we're going to have a couple of advocates that are really going to focus their efforts on those people. They are going to be trained. Another partnership that we have is Partners for Justice, who's a nonprofit, a national nonprofit agency who was very excited to come to the West and to the Flathead Reservation. They're going to recruit advocates for us and train them. They'll commit to 2 years to work for us, maybe recent college graduates who are going to focus on keeping the client at the center of all those services that we're trying to access. And so instead of case managers, we're calling them client advocates. And that's the model they'll be trained in. And we're hoping that that is going to help our clients seamlessly access services, because as Shanley will probably tell you, it's really difficult to get services these days when you have mental health issues, when you have co-occurring addiction issues. It's just really difficult. So you need an advocate to access it. We've had our justice and mental health collaboration program since 2009. It's allowed us to hire PhD candidates from the University of Montana in clinical psychology and they come up and work with our clients. We have two this school year who are doing all their work remotely. They're doing a lot of mental health screenings. Maybe Shanley and I can talk about that some, about how we believe courts should be focusing on screening people instead of making the diagnosis themselves, whether the person needs a mental health evaluation or a chemical dependency evaluation. And then finally, we have the Flathead Reservation Reentry Program, which we've had since 2015. And we have case managers, a reentry attorney. These are people that are assisting anyone who's incarcerated in any facility, whether it's tribal jail or the Montana State Prison, those folks that are returning to the Flathead Reservation that need assistance to reestablish themselves in the community and access services. There's all kinds of complications to dealing with the parole board, to offender registration issues, to collateral consequences, and then that seamless access to services that keeps our reentry program busy. I think that's it. I think I can turn it over to Shanley now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shanley Swanson. Thank you first and foremost, Anne and Sheldon especially, but also Monica Ainsley and Elton for all the technical support and help. I'm just going to provide a little short, brief summary of some of the work that we're doing, and I'm really honored to be here and glad to be here. So integrated evaluations is the service that I'm providing to reentry clients that are currently incarcerated in the tribal jail. And one of the tenets that we kind of work from is that good reentry services begin the day that they arrive in jail. I learned this working first in inpatient treatment facilities. Discharge planning begins the day that they arrive. And so I think reentry also begins the day that they arrive. So I'm providing a very specific service. These chemical dependency and mental health evaluations are integrated assessments that are really meeting the needs that the courts are often requiring clients to get. And as Anne said, sometimes the judges will say, it's almost like a blanket description of, you need to get a chemical dependency assessment and you need to complete a mental health evaluation. And prior, these were two separate services. They were two separate evaluations, and they were really often hard for our clients to access. They were long documents. The service providers that provide them, one of the only two providers that we have here on the reservation, almost went out of business when the Medicaid Expansion Act wasn't passed in Montana. And so we were all of a sudden at this total loss for a really important service that wasn't found anywhere else, but the judges were continuing to order these clients to complete these assessments. So I see my role as being able to offer the integrated assessment, which addresses both the mental health and the chemical dependency, and it takes care of both things. So if I'm evaluating a client that's currently incarcerated at the tribal jail, part of their sentence is to complete these two evaluations. When they leave, they walk out, and that's two things that they can just check off their list that they've already completed. It's done. And I think that's a real service to offer. And so the other reason why this service is important for our clients is because it's required for inpatient treatment. So we have in our state very few inpatient treatment providers. And like Anne said, it can be really hard for our clients to access that inpatient care. Sometimes they're on waiting lists for months. With everything that happened with COVID, we just kind of stopped getting calls back from one of the facilities at one point. And so with this, this is a client that's coming to you to say, I know I need treatment. I need inpatient treatment. And so if they're incarcerated at the tribal jail and they need a mental health evaluation just to be considered for a bed date, then that's something that we can provide and we can get the ball rolling. one of the best outcomes that we have and that we've been able to have with the integrated team here is that sometimes I can come in and provide the integrated assessment to a client that's facing a very long jail sentence at the tribal jail, that the case managers or the client advocates can help the client fill out all the necessary paperwork and collaborate with that treatment facility provider. And at times we've even had clients that have been released directly from jail. They've been transported to an inpatient treatment facility, and they've gotten to work on their recovery for the next 35, 40 days. And it counts as time for time. And those are just the moments that make your heart sing, because they're able to really access that care and service and come out usually for the better. So we have, like it says here, we just have only 2 service providers right now that are providing these specific evaluations on the reservation. They're far apart. It can be difficult to access care. One of the treatment providers actually has, these are typically really long documents, sometimes 5 to 7 pages. And one of the 2 providers often has the client come back for a second visit. So as you can see, that again, it puts another barrier in. They have to wait for their first appointment. They make that appointment maybe, then they have to come back the following week. Then the assessment itself takes 2 weeks to type it up and get it to the inpatient facility. All in all, this client is just waiting for care, and they're languishing in their need. So also important to note is that not every incarcerated individual needs an evaluation, and Anne sort of spoke to that when she talked about us working to educate the court system to say, don't use this as a blanket statement for every single person. Some of our clients might already be treatment connected. Some of them already might have therapists. They might already have a plan for themselves. They might have just gotten an evaluation 3 months ago. And so to do another is a duplication of services. So we really ask that, by having an interdisciplinary team, we can staff these cases, we can screen, and we can determine who may or may not be appropriate for that specialized service. Next slide, please. Addiction and trauma. I want to preface this slide by just saying that those of us that live and work in Indian country, and I'm sure those of you that are watching here today probably have a great understanding of this connection. So I don't mean to, I know this is not new information, and I think even in tribal courts and in multidisciplinary teams that are working and with Native American clients, it's often much more understood than majority culture courts. So I just really want to acknowledge that. Addiction, especially the kind that we're seeing that's impacting our clients and their families, and when a child is removed, typically what we're seeing, it stems from trauma. So at that level. And now finally, things that we all know intuitively and professionally is finally being backed up by scientific research like the ACE study. So looking at that. But I think one piece for me that resonates that maybe isn't always totally understood or discussed is that not only does the addictive behavior often stem from trauma, but the client is currently being traumatized by their continued addiction. So it's not just that trauma happened a long time ago and they're acting out about that trauma. It's that they're continually experiencing the trauma of losing their children, of being involved in the court system, of losing their jobs and their livelihoods when maybe at a different time in their life they functioned much better. There's a lot of guilt and shame that comes along with addiction. And that's something that I feel we're really trying to meet the client where they're at and acknowledge that. And just getting our heads around that as the professionals on this side of the table helps, our work with our clients. many court systems prosecute people for these addiction-related behaviors. And really, a lot of the time, what they're prosecuting is the client's inability to cope with their addiction or the lack of resources that are available to them. So I really interested in talking about this change talk to start to make it a little bit less that people are being punished and more that people are being supported in working through these major life issues. And I think that one of the ways that we're doing that at Reentry is to have that social worker embedded in the team, because what we're finding is that the social worker, I'm always looking at the lens of trauma. I'm always, when I see addiction, I'm always looking through that lens. So I can sometimes bring that back to my team in a way that's positive. And then this last point is always really important and heartfelt for me. The late Dr. Gita Sweeney, some of you may know her, hammered this into my head when I was decades ago, when I was learning about historical trauma and learning how to be a professional. And she talked about how we never, ever, ever talk about historical trauma without a discussion of contemporary resiliency. I know that resiliency can be kind of an overused, buzzword. We're all sort of getting a little bit tired of it in some ways, but are we though? Because our clients are the most resilient people that I know. I mean, they're the strongest people I know. And they have been through it, and so I just really always come back to that, because anytime that I look at the most down and out tribal member that I'm seeing at the tribal jail that's struggling with their mental health issues, I mean, these faces are flashing before my eyes, the stories as I'm talking about it. I'm thinking of these individuals that have impacted me and have really showed me their resilience and shared that with me. Those individuals are descendants of survivors, and they are all survivors themselves. And so if we frame our own understanding with that as the core concept, I think it really helps service provision that is inclusive, holistic, and respectful. Next slide. Why does client-centered care work? Basically, clients are often continually traumatized by systems. Sheldon really spoke to this a little bit at the beginning. They're continually being traumatized by systems that were set up in sort of this patriarchal way, that are often quite difficult and complex and confusing and sometimes very inefficient. And so all of you here, I'm sure, are really working hard to make those systems work for our clients and not against our clients. And so that's part of that change talk and that shift. It really is. And so when we come from the client-centered perspective, we can then help them move through the system in a way that works for them. Again, sort of to speak to what was said in the last slide, many of our communities aren't equipped with the needed services that would help every family succeed in its own way. Each family is going to need something different. And I know there's been so many times when I've personally just wished for more sober, supportive housing, a mental health crisis hotline that was specific to our community, an inpatient treatment facility that wasn't 75 miles away, or the next closest one is 3 hours away. I would really like some of those services in my community. So I think sometimes we have to understand that we're working with what we have and we're doing the best we can. Client-centered care also works because the clients often know what they need. So a quick example of this is I saw a reentry client, homeless, older gentleman, you know, in the summer, he was unhoused at that time and sleeping outdoors, drinking daily. And he came in and needed a chemical dependency assessment because he wanted to go to inpatient treatment. And so when I asked him, you know, what do you need today? Why are you here? His response to me was, if I'm going to stop drinking, I need treatment and I need detox. He knew that there was no way for him to do it on his own. Fast forward several months, I see him come through again for another evaluation. And I guess in my mind, I had thought, well, he needs an updated evaluation so that he can continue to access that inpatient treatment. He obviously never followed through with the recommendations. He didn't go to inpatient. He needs an updated eval. And we sat down and talked. And as we talked, as I started asking him, what is it that you really, really need? Instead of assuming that I knew that he needed to go to treatment, he started talking to me about how his life had changed. He'd been incarcerated in Missoula and he had detoxed there. Here nor there, it wouldn't have been my first choice for him, but it worked. And he got some sober time under his belt. And then he found sober housing. And he started going to AA meetings, and he got a prescription for naltrexone, which was a medication-assisted therapy for alcohol use disorder and cravings, and he was working with his doctor. And so I think had I sort of bulldozed in there thinking that I knew what he needed and that the recommendation, follow the previous recommendation. You didn't do what I told you, well, follow the previous recommendation. And finally, what it came out was he said, I'd really like to do outpatient treatment. I've been sober now 3 months. But if I go to inpatient treatment now, I'm going to lose my supportive housing. And so we rewrote the evaluation to show that the client knew what he needed when he came in to see me. It took a little bit. It took a little bit of navigating, and it took some listening, and it took me checking my own understanding of what I thought. But it finally came out, and I think it was really good outcome. The interdisciplinary therapist or addictions counselor can also sometimes provide a bridge. So communicating those client needs to the courts or to probation and other agencies. I've been lucky enough to build these relationships with probation officers and judges and all sorts of different service providers in our community. And so sometimes if I just pick up the phone and call, I can speak their language way quicker than any client could. I know which scheduler to talk to and what they need to put down when they make the appointment, and don't make it too early in the morning. And, and so really the interdisciplinary therapist can act as that bridge. We speak the client's language, and we also speak the language of the service provider. I think client-centered care really focuses on solutions instead of punishment and shame. And just that in itself, the idea that you're having somebody come in and ask you, what do you want? And where do you see yourself succeeding? And where do you want to go with this? And what would it look like if you were able to succeed in your goal for your recovery or for your mental health? Just that reframe alone, I think, can really help people feel less traumatized and less on the defensive, or less ashamed of their own self in that moment. And just motivational interviewing and solution-focused models are methods that I think, it kind of developed in social work and then are used in all these interdisciplinary ways that can be really super helpful to train staff members in, as just a way to sort of reframe some of these conversations that had previously been punitive, and now we're moving into that more respectful and solution-focused way of moving. So next slide, please. Just a few thoughts from me as an interdisciplinary team member. Many of this stuff just has been my own sort of reflections over the last couple of years that I've gotten to work with reentry. I've been providing chemical dependency evaluations in the tribal jail now since 2017. And it was a fight to get in there. I really saw Anne's program at work at one of their open houses that they had in 2016. And I knew right away I wanted to work with this group. I wanted to be a part of this. And that took a lot. It took a lot of convincing from the powers that be, but I was passionate about holistic defense. I didn't even really know what holistic defense was, but I was passionate about this population, and I really still truly believe that the clients that I'm serving at the tribal jail and with the reentry program are some of the most valuable members of our community. They're also some of the most vulnerable. And to me, that's important. So to serve. So I would just say to anybody that's creating an interdisciplinary team, find somebody that's really passionate about it, because not every therapist wants to go into the jail. Not every addictions counselor wants to work with this population. So really find somebody that wants to do it. Addictions, homelessness, mental illness, these are things that you should find when you're looking for somebody. Ask them about their experience with that, because these are our clients are really some of the very needs heavy, and they've had often experienced a lot of these different scenarios in their lives. And so having had somebody that has some experience in their background can be really helpful. Sort of like Anne said, I think, having that really dynamic and robust communication is important. So I'm included in an interdisciplinary staffing where I go and sit with the reentry program weekly, and we can staff cases. I learn so much every time I go because I'm not coming from that legal perspective. And so I really need to be there to see what is going on for the clients from the legal side. And so to be involved in that interdisciplinary staffing is just invaluable. We get a lot done during those times. One idea might be to collaborate or to share the position between multiple agencies. So I'm currently my position is paid for by Tribal Health. So it sort of takes away from that, having to operate on a shoestring budget from the reentry program. And I'm paid for through Tribal Health because all of the clients that I'm seeing, just by the nature that they're in the tribal jail, are IHS beneficiaries. So that's the connection. And that can really help to provide wraparound services as well. So I can refer them back to counseling. I can view their charts and their medical records if need be, to look at old medications, things like that. So it really helps to have kind of a foot in both places. And then the other thing that I would say would be to provide case management support for both the clients and for the therapist or the evaluators. So for example, case management support for me might mean if I'm referring someone to take a class or go to a treatment facility, there's going to be a lot of case management needs that need to happen within that time. Some of those I'm going to need from the case managers themselves. So communication about a bed date and transportation can be something that a case manager would really help, where it takes the burden off of the evaluator or the therapist. These clients, again, they're resource heavy. They just need a lot. It can often feel like a drop in the bucket. It's such a huge well that they need to fill. And so the needs are complex and they're multiple. And so case management really is a healing practice, because if we can just help put the building blocks here and here and here so that they have their driver's license back and their fines are manageable, and then they've got the safe and supportive housing, or they have these pieces of their life to start really building that security, then I can do my work as a therapist and say, okay, let's talk about your trauma. They're not going to be able to really do that therapeutic work until some of those case management needs are already established and they have that foundation of safety and security. So my last piece or thought would be just to never underestimate the power of case management and case managers or client advocates. They make the world go round. So thank you so much. And that's it.
Great. Maybe do we have your emails, and maybe we could put those in the chat box just so everybody could have access to your emails, because we do want to be thought partners with everybody. Their emails are. And I'll put my email there if you want to reach out. And we do want to be thought partners with you, and make sure that if you have any questions about this. I do have questions, and if you have a question about the presentation or a comment about the presentation, please put it in the comment box or the Q&A box, and we'll get to it. But I do have a question I want answered. So if I was new to this profession, I'm a tribal professional working in a tribal system. One, what are some action steps that maybe I'm brand new to this and I'm just barely learning about a multidisciplinary team or a holistic approach? What advice would you give to me as far as creating action steps to develop one in my jurisdiction? And then number two, who are the team players that I need to reach out to? So those are questions for you, Ann and Shanley. And I think you're on mute, Ann. The comment of 2020, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I know. I can tell you that how we did it was to take a look at our own community. What are the gaps in services? What are the barriers to services? And how are we going to address those? And who the players are really depends on what your resources are in the community that you're working from. What we decided early on was that what we saw was people, there were service providers, but there's so many barriers to accessing services. So we just decided we're going to do it ourselves. So we found resources to provide our own psychologists because people couldn't access, to provide a licensed addiction counselor like Shanley because people couldn't access. And so we tried to do it from the perspective of our clients and our community. And I think you don't, in terms of your interdisciplinary approach, I think you don't have to define it by profession necessarily. I think you should look at who you have in your existing staff that can take on a different role. So, I mean, we have case managers. One of them is a social worker. One of them is a person with an undergraduate degree in Native American studies. We've had a business major who was a case manager and one of the best we've ever had. So define it in terms of what the needs are and what you want the person to do. And try to get away so much from defining by degree, although we certainly need those. And I'll tell you that our PhD candidate psychologists have been invaluable. And one of the reasons they are is because not only do they provide services, but we've had two in the past that have researched our program and provided us some information on how best to serve our clients through their research. So I guess you start with identifying the needs, being creative in how you're going to address those needs, and then look into your community and who's out there just waiting to help. And that's how we developed our cultural mentoring program. There are people out there that want to help your clients, and see if you can find them and go to the people that are legit in your community, and get help in identifying who those people are.
Good point. I think it kind of button hooks to what Shanley was talking about. Is sometimes I know I'm guilty of this, as being my deficit approach of like, oh, we don't have these things, but definitely not talking about historical trauma when we don't talk about resilience, so being strength-based and looking at our community, what we do have and who are the strong players in our community. Shanley, do you have anything to add to multidisciplinary teams, advice you would give to somebody that might be new to this concept?
One thing that I think is important, just from the perspective of a social worker, and that is pretty unique to the discipline of social work that judges or others might not know if they're building these teams, is that social work really relies, good social work and good therapists and good addictions counselors have clinical supervision. And they have it frequently and they have it often because there's a lot of secondary trauma that happens doing this work. And so I think my only piece of advice, Anne really said it all and she's the one that developed it, but I would really say seek clinical supervision for your staff social workers if that is something that you do.
That's great. I think we do have, I think we're at time actually. And so thank you everybody for joining us on this this call. Hopefully next year we get to see each other in person. It's good to see at least your names. I know you guys are all change agents, and I know that's what's requisite for us to have impact on these systems. And so give an air applause to Shanley and Ann for taking the time to talk to us. And if you have any questions, please reach out to them. They've offered us their emails, and so flood them with emails, please.
Yeah, please do. I'm happy to talk about anything you're trying to start in your community. It's fun. I'm happy to talk to you about it.
Same.
Well, thank
Please
you.
reach out.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentation. That was fantastic. Anne is a great resource, and I know Sheldon and Shanley are as well. And we are out of time. Before we end today, I just want to make note of a couple of things. Someone asked whether the sessions are going to be recorded. Yes, all of the training sessions will be recorded, and we'll have those recordings up on the participant portal on the website, and on NIJA's YouTube channel as well. And we also have some winners for the door prizes. Let me pull up our list. So we have Amber Christensen Fox, Alyssa Bradshaw, Rebecca Wolf, and Michelle Krieger. And so we'll take your addresses from your registration information, and we'll send you some door prizes. And I hope everyone heard that who won. But thank you again, Anne, Sheldon, and Shanley, for your presentation this afternoon. And if anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to reach out. If not, we will see you tomorrow.
Whoever gets that shirt, maybe we could set up some sort of custody agreement where I could wear it half the days and you could wear it the other half. Thank you, guys.